Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Melissa. Today I'm making the Vintage Little Lady Eleanor pattern, which is a coat dress, and I'll be using the tween size range because I am making it for my niece. This project turned into an exercise in taking what I have and making it work, so much so that I ended up using 4 different fabrics from my stash. So going into this project, I knew I wasn't going to use the skirt pieces from the pattern because I wanted the skirt to be longer. And with the limited fabric that I had, I decided the best course of action was to cut out all of the bodice pieces while doing my best to save as much of my black fabric as possible for the skirt. So I cut the outer bodice and sleeve pieces from black fabric, and these are actually 2 different black fabrics. The bodice was cut from one, the sleeves and the skirt were cut from a different piece. And then for the bodice lining, I just cut that out of white fabric. And the cuff and collar pieces were all cut from this scrap daisy print fabric. In addition to that, I also had to cut out some iron-on interfacing pieces. And I started out by ironing interfacing onto the front bodice lining pieces as well as half of the collar pieces. Then I took 2 of the collar pieces, one with and one without interfacing, and placed them right sides together and sewed around 2 edges, leaving the shoulder and neckline edges unsewn. I did this for both collar pieces. Then clip the corners, turn the pieces right side out, and press them before basting them to the front bodice at the shoulders and necklines. Next, I'm sewing the front bodice pieces to the back bodice at the shoulder seams for both the main bodice and the lining. I then used the pattern to get the placement for 1/2 of the snaps, which serve as part of the dress closure. These went on one of the front bodice lining pieces. I am using metal snaps here because I find them easier to open and close than the plastic ones. And I did end up attaching the snaps onto the wrong front bodice lining piece. And all that means is that instead of the right side of the dress overlapping the left when it's finished, it's the opposite. I don't really consider that a big deal, and it would have been more trouble than it was worth to try and take those out after the fact. I placed the main and lining bodices right sides together and sewed up one front edge, around the neckline, and down the other front edge. Then clipped corners, flipped it right sides out, and pressed. Since the lining is a different color than the main fabric, I decided to go ahead and understitch the neckline. This just means I stitched the seam allowance to the lining, which helps the lining to not show from the right side of the garment. I don't usually do this because it's very fiddly to try and get into those corners when you're understitching, and oftentimes ends up being more trouble than it's worth to me. But after that was done, thankfully without having to rip out stitches, I sewed the bodice front and back together at the side seams. And I did that for both the main and lining bodices, sewing them each separately. Then I basted the 2 layers together at the arm sides. And now I'm back to attaching interfacing, this time onto half of the cuff pieces. I then paired all of the pieces together, making sure that they were both either interfaced or not, and sewed along the underarm seam. Now I'm unfolding and placing the 2 cuffs right sides together and sewing around 3 of the edges. And for the 3rd time in this video, clip, flip, and press those pieces. Sleeves in half, then sewed and serged the underarm seam before attaching the cuff to the sleeve hem, lining up the underarm seam. And this is actually done with the right side of the cuff facing the wrong side of the sleeve. I serged and understitched that seam before turning the sleeves right side out, folding up the cuff and pressing it. Now I'm sewing a running stitch around the top of the sleeve so that I can gather and sew the sleeve into the arm side. I then serged that seam and the bodice is done. Now onto the skirt. This was the hard part because I didn't totally have a plan here. here. So I cut the remaining black fabric in half with the cutting line parallel to the selvage. Now normally I would cut this in half from selvage to selvage, but in this case that would have made the skirt shorter and I needed the length more than I needed the width. And I sewed the two panels together along one side seam, or I guess technically it's going to be the back seam. Then I cut some strips of black fabric that were left over from the other piece of fabric I had, pressed it in half, and sewed and serged it to the front edges. On what will be the right side of the skirt, which won't be seen, I understitched the seam and just left it on. On the left side, I actually just folded the facing completely under and pinned it in place. I wanted to add a band of contrasting fabric to the bottom of the skirt, so I cut strips of my daisy fabric, then folded and pressed it in half with the wrong sides together. Now I unfolded it and sewed one layer of it to the hem of the skirt, leaving some overhanging on either edge. I then folded the contrasting band up so that the right sides sewed together, then trimmed off the excess and sewed the short edges, keeping my stitches in line with the edge of the skirt, and flipped it so that the right sides were out. On the wrong side of the skirt, I folded the raw edge of the contrasting band under and sewed it down. Then I pinned the skirt to the main bodice waist using inverted box pleats to pull in the fabric. I wasn't overly particular about it. I just kind of made the pleats the sizes that I thought looked good and were hopefully relatively even. And for placing, I tried to keep them in the same spots on either side. So I had pleats at the center front, the side seams, and then kind of somewhere in between the side and center pleats. Once I was happy with how it looked, I sewed it in place, then turned under the raw edge of the bodice lining and sewed it down. Next, I had to finish the closures, and that meant attaching the other half of the metal snaps to the front right bodice, then sewing buttonholes to the front left bodice and attaching the buttons to the right side. And at this point, I decided I didn't like the look of the white buttons. I had thought they would work because of the daisies and the contrasting fabric, but to me, they were just too stark of a contrast against the black. So I covered the buttons with my contrasting fabric by cutting a small circle, hand stitching around the edge, and pulling on it to gather it around the button. I then stitched through the fabric on the back side of the button to hopefully help secure it a little more. Obviously, this isn't the most secure way to make fabric covered buttons. There are actual kits that you can get, but I don't have any and I was determined not to have to buy anything for this project. But hopefully it will last a little while, and if the fabric comes off, it's not terrible. My niece can send it back and I'll just remove it from all of them. And the pattern calls for buttons on the cuffs where those pointed corners meet. I used smaller white buttons for that, and I didn't cover these because since they're on the contrast fabric, they actually looked better with white than they would have if they'd been covered. But I'm still not done. I had planned to do a contrasting belt. So I cut and sewed strips of the daisy fabric that were slightly taller than the size I wanted the belt to be and double the length that I needed. Then I folded it in half with the right sides together and sewed along both long edges. Turned it right side out and pressed. Then I lined the finished short edge up with the center front and sewed the belt to the bodice at the center back. I trimmed the unfinished edge to the needed size and just serged that edge to finish it. This piece goes under the other one so it won't be seen, and that's why I'm okay with leaving it like that. I made a bow by sewing a rectangle with the right sides together, leaving a hole so that I could flip it right sides out. I then pleated it in the middle and inserted it into a fabric loop. I stitched the bow to one edge of the belt and added half a snap to each of the edges to secure the belt. I used embroidery floss to create belt loops at the side seams, and since the front of the belt kept sagging, I sewed the side of the belt that did not have the bow on it to the front of the bodice to help support it. But I did do that off camera. Here it is finished. I realized I forgot to stitch down the front skirt facing, but it seems to be staying in place on its own, so I'll probably just leave it. And I am thrilled with how this turned out. This was literally using only items from my stash, but in some ways it turned out better than some of the projects that I put more planning into. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another handmade happening.